Hey story lovers, tonight's tale is about a little abandoned home that's full of secrets. My name is Clinton Manning and you're watching Tales by Firelight. So like 10 years ago, when I was going to school in Savannah, Georgia, I used to love to get sandwiches from this place called Zunzi's. And it's located right downtown Savannah. It's really good. If you ever go to Savannah, I recommend Zunzi's. Alright, now, there really isn't much of a place to sit there. So what I used to do is I used to go to the nearby square, the Oglethorpe Square, because they have a lot of benches and big shady trees, little pathways with a bunch of bushes. And it's the perfect place to kind of relax and have lunch. So I was sitting on a bench, eating a really delicious sandwich, but it was really big and it's really messy, and I'm kind of getting it all over myself and trying to eat, when this guy, this older gentleman, he walks up to me and he sits right down on the bench next to me. And I'm kind of embarrassed because I probably have mayonnaise all over my face, but he starts talking to me. Very friendly guy. So I start talking back, and pretty soon he's telling me his history of Savannah. 20 years of history with his family, places he's worked, and he knows what he's talking about. He's been there for a long time. When, after a while, our conversation took a turn, and we started talking about spooky things. And he said in the beginning, oh yeah, Savannah is definitely haunted. So I asked him, have you had any paranormal experiences? Why do you say it's haunted? So he looked at me, paused for a minute, and then he began to tell me a story of his childhood in Mississippi. So he was originally from New York, but when he was a boy, around 12 years old, his uncle died, who lived in Mississippi, and left his family all of his property and a beautiful home. So at 12 years old, he would love to ride his bike. Don't want to forget about that. And his name was Wayne, by the way. So Wayne would ride his bike all over the place. But when he moved to Mississippi, he loved riding his bike even more because he was used to riding through a crazy busy downtown full of cars and traffic and everything, where when he was in Mississippi, he was free. There was so much space in Mississippi that he was able to ride on old dirt roads without the cluster of downtown traffic, and really enjoyed his time while he lived there. A very peaceful place. Now, so he was a good helper, right? So he was helping take all of his stuff up to his room. He was lucky because he got one of the best rooms in the whole house, which was the attic room. It was one of those rooms that kind of has a pointy top, and it had two big windows on each side and plenty of space for him to put all of his things in his bed. So he brought up a really heavy box, and he was tired, so he put it down, and he sat down next to his big beautiful window and was enjoying the scenery. And as he looked, he could see so far into the distance, trees and lots of farmland, really green, beautiful place. But as he was looking out the window, he saw a little home. It wasn't really close to his house, but it was, maybe 500, 600 feet. He could see a little home. And it was a wreck. And he got really curious about that house. So he went downstairs to talk to his dad, and he asked him, hey, there's a little teeny house over there. Do you know, is that on our property? And his dad said, actually, Wayne, it is on our property, but you're not allowed to go there because it's abandoned, no one has been taking care of it, and I don't want you to get hurt. And so Wayne, like any kid, he actually got even more curious. So that first week of school was kind of rough because he's the new kid, but he made a friend named George. And him and his friend, they were riding their bikes all over the place. After school, they'd go on long journeys through his property and through all the rest of the area. So one night, he was with George in his room, and he had a really nice lantern. So, it must have been the 1940s. So he had this lantern that he would use to illuminate his room, and they were looking at comic books. When Wayne was sitting by his window, he looked out, and that little house, the abandoned one, had lights coming from it. And he was a little bit territorial, so he looked at the house and immediately thought, who is on my property? So he looked out the window, and he saw the abandoned house full of light. And it was really far, so he couldn't really see anything, but it was flickering, as if some people were there. Somebody was walking around. And he was about to ask his friend George, do you see that house? And when he looked at his friend, who was actually standing next to him by the window, looking out the window, his friend's face went pale. And his friend said, "Oh, we don't ever want to go near there. I know of people that say that at night they can hear music coming from that place. So stay away." And that made Wayne even more intrigued. But just then, his father came up, told him it was time for bed, and George had to go home. So the next day, at school, Wayne couldn't stop thinking about that little abandoned house. So he met up with George on their bike ride home and said, "Let's go over there and explore." And George really didn't want to. But Wayne kept begging and eventually convinced George to go on him in this little adventure. So they went they went home, and they had to check in first before they could leave. When his father said, "Sorry, Wayne, you got to do chores. There's no way you're going anywhere right now." So Wayne had to do chores. George had to wait. So hours went by until he finally finished, and now it was dusk. And the sun was starting to set, but he could still see pretty good visibility. It was still daytime. So they got on their bikes, and they made their way out to the little abandoned house. They took a little dirt road that took them up to a wall of bushes. And as they rode into the little path, a side path that was even smaller than the main road, they found themselves in the presence of this broken down shack. So the sun had set a little bit more, and they could see lights coming from inside the house. I mean, there was someone inside the house. And as they put their bikes down, they kind of started creeping up to the house. And they saw multiple shadows. There was definitely people in there. But the closer they got, they began to hear music as well. The sound of a party with violins and banjos, and people talking and laughing. And George was getting scared. He's like, "Wayne, we should get out of here." But Wayne, kind of being stubborn, it's like, "No, we're going to spook these guys. They're never coming on our property again." So they snuck up to the house, and they could totally hear. The music was very audible. They could hear everything. And they walked all the way around the house, trying to peek through the windows. But they couldn't get a good look because they were a little bit too short to peek into the windows. So they went up to the front door. He grabbed the doorknob, and with force, really quick, he pushed it open and went, "Ha!" But there was no one there. The music turned off. There was no sound. The lights were off, and he was kind of shocked to see nobody, because he thought he was definitely going to surprise some trespassers. So he walked in, began to look around, and he noticed that the floor was really, really old and missing floorboards, and every step he took made large creaks. And he started feeling a little bit creeped out because it was a freaky little place, when suddenly he felt something pull on the back of his shirt. And when he looked around, all freaked out, he was relieved to see that it was just George. And when George saw Wayne walk into the house, he got worried, so he came to rescue his buddy. So George, when he walked in, he said, "Let's get out of here, Wayne. The sun is almost setting, and we don't want to be here after dark." But as George looked around the room, his curiosity took over his fear. So he started to explore that first room, which was kind of a kitchen of sorts. And as they walked around, they started looking through the pantry, and George, he knocked over a big bag of flour, and some flour spilled onto the floor. And Wayne got an idea. So what they did was they grabbed little tin cans, and they filled it up with flour, and they started dusting, spreading the flour all over the floor. And they actually started having some fun doing it. They were throwing a little bit on each other, and they covered that entire place with flour. And the idea was, Wayne thought it was very clever, was to put flour on the floor to catch any footprints. And then they would be able to have some evidence of the trespassers. So when they were about finished, it started getting too dark to really see what they were doing. They walked backwards, shaking their little tin can full of flour, and they left the home. They got on their bikes, and they were excited to come back the next day to see what kind of evidence they could find. Time wouldn't go by soon enough. Wayne couldn't stop thinking about going to that house and catching his trespassers. So he went to his house after school, and he grabbed George, and this time they were going prepared. They had backpacks, and they put all the essentials, granola bars, flashlights, pocket knives, slingshots, and they were getting ready to have this adventure. when Wayne's father again, okay, Wayne, you need to come with me to do some chores. George can come along if he wants. So they hopped in the back of Wayne's father's truck and went into town to help him run some errands. So when they returned back to their home, it was already dusk and the sun was setting again. Well, this time, Wayne was prepared. He went up to his room and he grabbed his big, strong lantern to light up the whole area because he wanted to make sure he could see everything. So they got on their bikes with their backpacks and they went off to go explore the abandoned home one more time. So they rode down the same road, then they got off on the little trail that led to the house, and this time it was a bit darker, and again there was lights coming from inside, and he could see people. There was no mistaking that there were people in this house. They could both see them, and they could hear people laughing, talking, and they could hear the music. So this time they stayed along the bush and crept up to the corner of the home so they don't get seen through the windows. And instead of going through the front door, they went to the side door. And Wayne put his hand on the doorknob, and they both counted to 3. 1, 2, 3. And boom, they opened the door. Close the door. Okay, so Wayne put his hand on the doorknob, looked over at George, and together they counted 1, 2, 3, and they swung that door open and said, "Ha!" Again, nothing. It was dark. There was no sound. There was no one. So they walked into the kitchen. They put their lantern on the table and lit it. And as they started walking around, they saw on the ground footprints everywhere. All shapes and sizes, shuffling all over the place. Like there was tons of people walking around, but there was no one there. George, at this point, had already backed out and was outside waiting because he was feeling so scared. So bravely, Wayne held up his lantern, looked around, and he said, "I know you're in here. You're on private property. You need to leave." So he started walking in the dark into the kitchen again. But strangely, all the light that it normally emits from this powerful lantern was starting to dim. It's like the darkness was starting to surround him. And he began to feel scared. And he felt like he should leave. So he started to back up. When he tripped and fell on the floor, and the lantern just was destroyed on the ground with a huge crash. Glass went everywhere. And he found himself sitting on the floor in pitch black darkness. Starting to tear up from fear, he reached down to grab his lantern and started to stand up. But as he looked up, began to see faces all around him. And these faces looked upset, giving him a stern look, and he immediately felt that he was not wanted. So he completely stood up. And, this is a 12-year-old boy, surrounded by these adults. And the more he looked, the more he recognized the house was packed. So he started walking backwards, and he turned around. No one said anything to him. They were just giving him dirty looks. And as he walked those 10 steps towards the door, Wayne told me that day that was the longest walk, 10 steps he had ever taken. And as he walked, holding his broken lantern, he would look left and right because they opened a pathway for him to walk out, one stern face after the next. Well, finally he reached the door and he was about to walk out when he felt a shove, a really strong force that knocked him down on the floor, and he landed on the ground hard. That was enough for him. So he stood up, and all around him the lights turned on, illuminating his view, and the music started, and it felt like it was all around him, and he could hear the banter of people laughing and joking, and he ran to his bike. He saw George at the edge of the property waiting for him on his bike, and they rode as fast as they could, and they never went back. But Wayne said that sometimes at night, from the safety of his room, he would look out his window and he could see the lights shimmering in the distance of that old abandoned house. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I did. So if you'd like to see more, follow See First on Facebook or subscribe and hit that little bell on YouTube so you don't miss another tale. Alright, until next time, goodbye.